The United Kingdom needs to leave the European Union for the citizens' best interests. That's what Leave campaigners were advocating in 2016 when the nation was called to vote on its future in the Union. A vote at the end of which the people had decided that it was in their best interests to leave the EU. But what did they base this vote on? Several personal reasons, yes, and maybe some that impacted national sovereignty. But how many people among the 51% majority thought about trade? Based on what we know now, it'd be a fair bet to say none of them. That's a bold claim to make, isn't it? But that's exactly what we're here to unravel. How Brexit impacted trade with the EU and how new EU rules are further alienating the UK. Is there a way back into the EU single market, or is it time to look elsewhere? Let's find out. Following the results of the 2016 EU referendum, the United Kingdom announced its decision to withdraw from the European Union. Effectively, the Great British Exit from the Union, often simply referred to as Brexit, ending a relationship with the largest socio-economic and political union in Europe, did not come easy. Not necessarily because the UK had a binding agreement with the EU and couldn't leave, but because it wasn't a straightforward process to begin with. Aside from calls for a revote, a decision has to be made on whether the UK wanted a deal or a no-deal Brexit. Per the EU's mandate, member states reserved the right to leave the Union in a no-deal situation where they would, in effect, wipe their hands clean of the Union. In turn, the Union will also wipe its hands clean of the former state. Understandably, it was in Britain's best interest to form some sort of a deal with the Union before divorcing it. Yes, that's what it was called, divorcing the EU. Were there whispers of a no-deal Brexit taking place? Well, of course there were. The UK saw 3 prime ministers enter and exit office from the day the referendum was held to the day Brexit officially happened. A suitable deal had to be made before Britain left the EU, and that was proving to be more challenging than leaving the Union altogether. Finally, Boris Johnson entered office, a champion of the Leave campaign, and he vowed to get Brexit done during his term. A man of his word, Johnson saw the UK shaking hands with the EU one last time and formally saying goodbye, but not before forming an everlasting, albeit now distant, relationship. And that brings us to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA. What was it? Was it beneficial for the UK? How was the economy fared since leaving the EU? That's what we're here to understand. Signed on December 30th, 2020, the TCA established the framework for the political, economic, and security relationship between the two sides, with the goal of maintaining cooperation and avoiding the worst economic disruptions that could have stemmed from a no-deal Brexit. It's worth remembering, however, that Boris Johnson had once teased the idea of a possible no-deal Brexit when it seemed like negotiations were taking way longer than intended. You should know that Theresa May was in and out of Parliament almost every other day, coming up with terms that would be deemed suitable by every British official. That seemed nearly impossible, so Johnson's suggestion of a no-deal exit wasn't completely unwarranted. In any case, despite the tensions that were running high back then, the UK knew that it would need access to certain EU amenities and privileges, namely the single market. For those of you who might not know, the EU single market is a no-tariff marketplace that exists between the EU member states. Simply, all member states are allowed to trade freely with one another without any hindrance from local governments, additional taxes, and laws. Of course, each country regulates trade in the single market per its own laws. It's just meant to streamline trade. The UK, by the way of the English Channel, has always been one to benefit from trading within Europe and beyond. The nation held an important position as a key trader in the single market, and that wasn't something they were willing to let go of, Hence, when a deal was reached, the first thing Johnson asked was, what about trade? That leads us to the TCA. As Prime Minister, Johnson pursued a desire to trade freely with the EU just like before. Yes, there would be some changes, but Johnson wanted to minimise those changes as much as possible, especially being subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. But a deal was not going to be unilateral. The UK had to give something to get something. The EU proposed that the price for the UK to enter the single market was compliance with EU subsidies, social, environmental, and other regulations to avoid competition in a market that's quite literally called the single market. Another major point of contention was, believe it or not, fisheries. Part of the impetus for Brexit was the British desire to regain full control over their fishing waters, whereas EU coastal states demanded to retain all or most of the fishing rights they enjoyed under the EU's common fisheries policy. Formal trade negotiations, in which Michael Barnier represented the EU and David Frost represented the UK, began on the 31st of March 2020. They were originally due to be concluded by the end of October 2020. However, negotiations continued and formally ended on the 24th of December 2020, when an agreement was reached in principle after 10 negotiating rounds. The 1,246-page agreement covered objectives and framework with provisions for fisheries, social security, trade, transport, visas, and cooperation in judicial, law enforcement, and security matters. After approval by the Council of the European Union on the 29th of December, the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, signed the TCA on the 30th of December 2020 on behalf of the EU. The agreement was then flown to London and signed for the UK by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The TCA established a joint governance framework with an independent arbitration mechanism to resolve disputes. It includes a partnership council, committees, and working groups to oversee the implementation of the agreement. Unlike the EU's previous trade deals, this agreement allows for the imposition of retaliatory measures, such as tariffs if one side breaches the rules. Here's what the TCA entailed. The TCA ensured zero tariffs and zero quotas on goods traded between the UK and the EU, provided that these goods meet specific rules of origin requirements. However, while the agreement avoided tariffs, the new administrative processes increased the cost and complexity of doing business. Next came trade and service, and unlike the relatively smooth flow of goods, the TCA did not provide UK service providers with the same access to EU markets as before. The deal introduced substantial restrictions for service sectors such as finance, legal, and creative industries. UK-based financial firms, in particular, lost the passporting rights that allowed them to operate freely across the EU. Instead, firms would need to set up operations within the EU or navigate different national regulations on a case-by-case basis. This became a major point of contention later on. As far as fisheries were concerned, the TCA provided for a transitional period of 5.5 years, during which EU fishing boats would have phased access to UK waters, after which the UK would fully control its exclusive economic zone. Fishing rights and quotas would then be negotiated annually. An interesting feature of the agreement is the rebalancing mechanism, which allows either party to impose tariffs if it believes that regulatory divergence is distorting trade. This was to ensure that trade with a former member state still ensured a level playing field for member states who wanted to trade with each other. The agreement was provisionally applied from 1st of January 2021 until its entry into force on the 1st of May 2021. The initial ultimate date for the end of the provisional application was extended from the 28th of February to the 30th of April 2021. The government and the EU have agreed a trade deal to take effect after the end of the Brexit transition period. MPs are due to vote on whether to accept or reject the deal on Wednesday. Do you think MPs should vote to accept the deal or reject the trade deal? The people had voted to leave the European Union, and now the people had decided if the TCA was fair. According to a YouGov survey, 57% of respondents wanted the UK to accept the TCA, and 9% wanted to leave them to renegotiate the terms. Conservative voters were more in favour of the TCA than Leave supporters. Altogether, 17% of respondents believed that accepting the TCA was in the UK's best interest, 21% didn't, 31% didn't know if it was good or not, and another 31% were neutral. However, as far as the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was concerned, the TCA was a fair and balanced agreement that would allow Europe to leave Brexit behind us and look to the future. Meanwhile, in the UK, Johnson claimed that the TCA had panned out perfectly for the country, claiming that the agreement allowed Britain to regain the sovereignty that it had wanted when it decided to leave the EU. Johnson claimed that the TCA allowed the UK to take control of its own laws, borders, money, and trade, all promises he'd made when he urged voters to vote to leave the Union. Johnson might have had a lot to lose by not seeming overtly enthusiastic about the TCA, but even the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, agreed that the TCA was in Britain's best interest. Not that the Labour Party particularly enjoyed some of its clauses, but that they were too afraid of the alternative, a no-deal Brexit. Starmer claimed that his party would seek additional labour and environmental protections in the TCA if and when elected. It's worth noting that Starmer became the UK's latest Prime Minister in 2024. No such amendments have been made to the TCA as of yet. Starmer's party was the only one that supported the TCA, however. The Scottish National Party and all other opposition parties vehemently opposed the conditions outlined by the TCA. Not because they were particularly against the TCA, but because it signalled the end of the UK's straightforward entry into the single market. This would be as good of a time as any to remind everyone that the referendum has been held in Scotland alone. The UK would still be in the EU. But that's a topic for another video. Back to the TCA. Eurosceptic Conservative MP and Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage endorsed the TCA, but the Bow Group wrote that it would not adequately restore UK sovereignty. The British fishing industry was disappointed that the agreement did not more significantly reduce EU access to British waters. It was a mixed bag, and nothing could be done. The TCA went into effect. Despite the support that went through for the TCA, it turns out that the small group that opposed it were right. The TCA did impact trade between Britain and the EU. In hindsight, why wouldn't it? A report released by Aston University Business School said that the TCA, as the two sides fully cut ties, has profound and ongoing stifling effects on the economy. The study highlights that the negative impacts of the TCA have intensified over time, with 2023 showing more pronounced trade declines than previous years, per the report. This suggests that the transition in UK-EU trade relations post-Brexit is not merely a short-term disruption, but reflects deeper structural changes likely to persist. Let's rewind for a bit, because we have to make some things clear. The TCA was and wasn't the best deal for Britain. You have to remember that the UK wanted to enjoy member status without actually being a member, and while the EU was willing to give it special privileges, it wasn't willing to put it above the EU 27. This meant that this was the best deal Britain was going to get. The UK has been experiencing economic hardship ever since it voted to leave the EU in 2016 and subsequently exited the bloc in 2020. But to add to an already struggling economy, the COVID-19 pandemic effectively shut the world down, and then of course Russia launched a full-blown invasion of Ukraine. Between 2021 and 2023, monthly data showed a 27% drop in UK exports and a 32% drop in imports to and from the EU. Compared to how things would have been had Brexit not happened, according to the Aston report, things don't seem to be improving much when we look at the figures on a yearly basis. Exports declined by 17% and imports by 23%. The analysis reveals a heavily disrupted and weakening UK-EU supply chain post-TCA evident across consumer, intermediate and capital goods, per the report. It did note, however, that a handful of sectors saw an increase in exports: tobacco, railway and aircraft. The worst affected ones would be the agri-food, textile and material-based manufacturing sectors. Notably, these sectors experienced the most dramatic decline in UK export value, plummeting by 73.46%. This was the general overview of trade with the UK. Let's talk specifics. Specifically, smaller economies seem to have benefited from trade with the UK in light of Brexit, which, we have to be honest, isn't exactly what the UK was gunning for. UK exports to Belgium and Ireland saw milder reductions, according to the report, while this was more substantial in Germany, Spain and Greece. For UK imports, the Netherlands, Germany and France saw significant drops of 51%, 32% and 23% respectively, The Economist said. In the end, the report talked about ways to mitigate the economic effects of Brexit, especially considering how it contributed to the inflated cost of living in the UK. The word of the day here would be stabilise. Opening sector-specific negotiations with the EU to try and mitigate the effects on the sectors worst affected by Brexit and the TCA, and using new technology to streamline custom procedures could help the British economy, as well as reconfiguring its supply chains. But the bigger question here would be, will the EU open up the panel for discussion? The TCA contains what's known as review clauses, which set states to review and assess the implementation of the entire agreement every 5 years. The first review is due in 2026. Remember how Keir Starmer wasn't completely on board with the TCA but agreed to it regardless, suggesting he'd bring changes when he comes into office. Again, no significant changes have been made, but an agenda has been set. Starmer has ruled out any significant changes, such as rejoining the EU single market and customs union, yet he has vowed to reduce post-Brexit red tape and reset relations with the UK's European partners. The scheduled TCA reviews may give him the opportunity to make significant changes to the deal, but we'll have to wait and see when that happens, if at all. Britain tested out the TCA for a whole year before ultimately coming to the conclusion that things needed to change, even if they didn't want them to. Johnson had claimed that he would get Britain the best deal he could in the wake of the country's exit from the bloc. To be fair, he did. This was just the grim reality of leaving the Union. Trade would be impacted. In 2021, following the departure from the EU's trading system, the UK has been trying to strike trade deals with countries around the world. It's worth considering that the ability to strike free trade deals was one of the benefits of leaving the EU, according to Leave supporters. Since Brexit, the UK has signed trade deals and agreements in principle with about 70 countries and one with the EU. Free trade deals would encourage trade between Britain and other countries, making trade cheaper and simpler. Goods and services, although it has to be clearly mentioned. A majority of these trade deals are simply rollovers. They copied the terms of deals the UK previously had when it was an EU member, rather than creating new trade agreements. In October 2020, the UK signed a trade deal with Japan, its first major agreement since leaving the EU that was different from the existing EU-Japan trade deal. This was followed by a historic agreement with Australia, which was the first trade deal the UK negotiated from scratch after Brexit. However, UK farmers expressed concern that cheaper imports could undercut them, potentially leading to job losses. In response, the UK government assured the public that the agreement included protections for the farming sector. In June 2021, the UK expanded its trade ties by signing a deal with Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, building on a previous agreement it had with those nations. A few months later, on the 28th of February 2022, a new trade deal was signed with New Zealand. Although New Zealand is a relatively small trading partner, accounting for less than 0.2% of the UK's total trade, this agreement may result in an increase in New Zealand lamb being sold in the UK. The UK government also announced plans to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, an existing trade pact involving 11 Pacific Rim nations. The government expects to finalise this membership before 2025. Meanwhile, trade negotiations with India began in early 2022, but no agreement had been reached by 2024. Similarly, a trade deal with the US, once a priority in the Conservative Party's 2019 manifesto, has not materialised yet. In June 2023, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak acknowledged that a comprehensive free trade agreement with the US had not been a priority for a while now. However, the Atlantic Declaration was signed, a more limited economic agreement called. Negotiations with Canada for a post-Brexit trade agreement, on the other hand, have stalled after nearly 2 years of back and forth, starting in 2022. The breakdown occurred over disagreements about beef and cheese. Canada has been pressurizing the UK to lift a ban on hormone-treated beef, arguing that the ban effectively prevents its producers from accessing the British market. On the other hand, the UK has concerns about the high 245% import tariffs Canada imposed on British cheese at the start of the year. Despite the challenges, Downing Street stated that the government remains committed to negotiating deals that benefit the British people and is open to resuming talks with Canada in the future. Do you think the UK economy will bounce back?